Hello and welcome to Healing After Suicide Loss, the interview series on how to let go of your guilt, find peace, and move forward one day at a time. I created the series to give you all a go-to place with plenty of helpful resources, advice, and encouragement from those who are experts in their field to help you move forward with your life. Let's make a deal. Commit to taking one action after you watch this interview, because time alone doesn't heal all wounds. You need to work through your grief to make life livable again. I'm your host, Carolin Brookings, and with me today is Sara Cobb. Sara is the founder of My Grief Connection, a hub of grief resources and a growing support community. She felt called to connect fellow grievers with resources to find hope and healing after loss following the tragic deaths of her two older brothers, 43 years apart, one by a freak accident and one in a murder-suicide. Her passion and advocacy for grief literacy and mental health education grew from a combination of her interests, strengths, and life experiences. In the fall of 2021, she returned to university to pursue a Master's of Science in Counseling Education with a focus on clinical mental health counseling in grief, crisis, and trauma. Sara is also the co-leader of a virtual support group for survivors of murder-suicide loss. Welcome, Sara. It's so good to have you back here. Tell us a bit more about your story and how you got here.
Thank you, Carol. Yeah, it's just an honor, and I'm really glad to be included in this series and to share my story. So yeah, I arrived here at the grief and loss space because of an accumulation of some life events. I was actually born into a grieving family. My oldest brother, Stephen, died in an accidental electrocution when he was just about a month shy of turning 7. My other brother, Skylar, my other older brother, was about 4 when this happened, and he was there and witnessed this. I never got to meet Stephen because I was born 11 months after he died. So my family was really going through this really acute grieving process while they were expecting my birth and in the first couple of years or so of my life. And I grew up always knowing about Stevie. I mean, it wasn't a secret. His story wasn't a secret. I knew about him and we talked about him, and I get to see pictures and hear stories. But as an adult, I really began to see how the trauma of his death shaped our family dynamic and had a significant impact on the way that I developed and how I saw the world. And then fast forward 43 years, and the thing that really forced me to face personal and profound grief was the death of my brother Sky almost 4 years ago in a murder-suicide, and he was the perpetrator of that. So on July 4th of 2018, he really spiraled into hopelessness in this bipolar hypermanic state, and in the wake of the breakup of his most intimate relationship, exacerbated by some alcohol use that day, and in a desperate attempt to end pain from years of trauma, he acted very impulsively, and he shot and killed himself. And then immediately before that, though, he took the life of his fiancée. They were discovered by her best friend the next day. And hearing the news about that and losing my brother and his fiancée and this murder suicide was really the most devastating thing that I've ever experienced. It was just such a severe and heartbreaking shock to everyone that knew them. And my family lost 2 beloved family members, which was gut-wrenching, and really surreal. And I don't think I'll ever fully wrap my mind around what happened, but I've come to accept the reality of the losses. And it's still, though, it's hard to understand how the loving man that I knew so well, could have done something so shockingly out of character.
Yeah, and I'm so sorry for your losses, and I'm grateful you're here. I'm grateful that you're linking people up with the resources that they need, and I'm also grateful that you're here sharing your story, because I know we've talked before that, if we think about the stigma of suicide, that's one thing, in the isolation sometimes that suicide loss brings with itself. And I always feel like murder suicide, that's just another level on top of everything that we experience just as suicide loss survivors. So thank you for being here.
Yeah, definitely.
And now let's talk to those people who are longing to let go of their guilt so that they can find peace and move forward. Firstly, can you share with us how you were able to go from the shock and the pain of those early stages of grief that you mentioned to be in a place now to connect others with grief support resources?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, it's been quite a journey for sure. After the deaths of my brother and his fiance, my world really turned upside down, and I struggled a lot to function and to just fit the pieces of my new reality back together again. I wrestled with a lot of guilt, and I felt like, that there was something that I should have done to prevent this, or that I should have known that he was in a really vulnerable mental state. But after a few months, I really, was stewing in this grief and guilt, and thankfully was able to connect with an outstanding counselor that helped me quite a lot. We did some intensive therapy for about 6 to 8 months. And I continued to do some regular sessions, but that work that we did up front really helped so much address the shame and the guilt and the pain I was going through. And now, when I have sessions with her, that's sort of in the background, and it's something that comes up sometimes, but it's not the focus anymore. I can focus on other things in my life, other stressors and things that need work. So for me, grief counseling really helped a huge amount. And after about 9 months, I found a local suicide loss support group and started attending that regularly. And so that was really helpful as well, just being able to speak to other survivors that had been through something sort of similar. I mean, it's not the same, but it was helpful. Definitely that extra element of the murder part makes it different. And so I didn't feel fully sometimes like I could connect as much as I would have liked to with some of the other survivors in the group because of this extra component that I was dealing with. But it was definitely useful to me. And then having folks supporting me really helped me get perspective from outside of my own head, which was a good thing, because I was really living in my mind, and reliving things over and over again. And I needed to kind of see from someone else's point of view what was going on. So that first year, I really just spent countless hours counseling, reading about grief, journaling, attending support group, creating art and receiving body work, and kind of pursuing some other healing modalities as well. And I have a background in library reference, and I'm also an amateur family genealogist. So for me, a coping thing that I did was using my research skills to compile and organize grief resources. For me, I needed more information to kind of process what was going on, and that helped to take that stuff in, to read and to research. And unfortunately, though, there weren't very many specific murder-suicide loss support materials out there. There's very little at all, and I didn't know how to contact other survivors of murder-suicide loss. And one day I was just complaining to my counselor about how hard it was to find grief support. And like there wasn't one place I could go, there wasn't like a hub of resources I could go to. And she just sort of challenged me in that and said that maybe there was something that I could do to find a solution for that problem. And at first I was kind of annoyed and I didn't really want to have to do the work myself. But I thought about it, and I soon realized that she was right, and that who better, to do it than me, because I knew what I needed, and then I could do that research and put it together, and hopefully other people out there are enough like me that they could benefit from those things as well. So if I wanted a solution, then I would have to create it. So I spent the first loss anniversary creating the first version of my grief connection. Of the website, I started just adding a few links to some basic resources, some things locally that I thought might be helpful. It was just, inspired by that seed that my counselor planted, but also just the desire to do something to honor my loved ones, to do something on that day to help the day become a little bit more sweet than bitter, to find a way that I could take back power that day. And soon after that, I started Facebook and Instagram accounts and just began sharing resources on social media. and I was asked to share my story publicly at a local walk for suicide prevention a couple months later. And that really was the first time I talked publicly and said, what happened. And that was a turning point for me, for sure. And it was an opportunity for me to share about my grief connection, get the resources out there. So I'm very grateful that I had that chance. And my grief connection's really grown since then, with a mission to empower grievers to find community and hope by connecting them with resources that will guide them toward their own personal paths for healing.
Yeah, I think that's brilliant. And thank you so much for sharing as well some of the things that helped you in the early days, because I always know, there's so many things that we can try, and our viewers might think, oh, that might be something that I like to try. So thank you for that. And I'm so grateful that your counselor gave you that little push in the right direction, because you have got, like you said yourself, you've got all the skills from library researching that you need to find everything and connect grievers with resources. So I think that's brilliant. Yeah. So can you talk a little bit about the different types of guilt that we might feel as suicide loss survivors or murder-suicide loss survivors?
Yeah. And I think it's really important to talk about and distinguish guilt and shame, because those things are really connected. I think a lot of times it's hard to pick those apart, and we feel guilty, we say we feel guilty, but really what we're feeling is shame. And so I just want to talk about that just a little bit. I think shame is when we believe that we are bad or unworthy, or there's something wrong or broken with us. But we usually feel guilt or feel guilty when we do something bad, something that we know is wrong while we're doing it, or right after we were like, oh, that was a big mistake, that was wrong, I did something wrong. But it's more about the action of the doing that's wrong than us being wrong. So just want people to kind of keep that in mind as we're talking. Even if we know logically that we didn't cause the death or we didn't do anything wrong, we might still feel that guilt feeling because we're still alive and our people or person is not. The guilt might also creep up on us when when our intense sort of feelings of grief start to subside. We might start to feel better. We might laugh, or we might have a good day. And then all of a sudden we feel like we're being disloyal to our loved one because they'll never experience those things again, or because, we aren't drowning in our grief 24/7 anymore. So that can be an interesting kind of grief feeling or an effect that we can have. Grief can pop up in those weird ways. And sometimes we can even carry guilt for feeling guilty. So we get in this cycle of feeling bad that we feel bad. And then we can also feel, angry at the person or the situation that took them from us. And that can make us feel guilty as well. We can experience true guilt when we clearly do something wrong that's like morally, ethically, legally wrong. True guilt can be positive and valuable because it can drive us to, repent or make restitution or fix wrongdoing that we've done. But we can also have false guilt, and that can feel like, we did something wrong when we actually didn't. And it feels really terrible. And usually it's it has more negative consequences and it evokes blame and self-criticism and those feelings of shame, like there's something wrong with us. So I think it's good to know that there's true and false guilt and what kind of the differences of those. And there's some really interesting research out there by Margaret Miles and Alice Demi. They identified 6 different types of grief, or of guilt. And it's not unusual to experience, all kinds of guilt. You can experience multiple types at once or at different times. You go through these, phases with it. So just know that feeling guilt can be part of the normal grief cycle. But research indicates that unresolved or high levels of guilt can really complicate our grief and make it much harder for us to process through. So there's 6 types. So the causation guilt is when individuals feel responsible for the loss because of something that they failed to do or that they did. So whatever that thing was, it caused or it didn't stop the loss from happening. So we feel like we're at fault. And then with moral guilt, the person grieving believes that that the loss is some sort of punishment for a prior act. So maybe that God is punishing them for something they did in the past, or for something in the relationship that, you know, was done wrong or something. So it's that, you know, feeling that they're being punished. And then role guilt is feeling that you failed in your role as in the person's life, that maybe you weren't a good enough spouse or parent or sibling or friend or child. You know, we feel that there's really a guilt there related to the state of the relationship with your person. And then grief guilt is where we feel guilty that we aren't grieving well, that maybe we're grieving too hard, and perhaps we have really poor coping skills, and that we're falling apart, or that we're crying too much. And the flip side of that is recovery guilt, and that's where grievers sense that they're coping too well, and maybe they aren't crying enough, and maybe other people are judging them and thinking they're moving on too fast, or, you know, there's a lot of judgment there of not feeling like you're doing grief right. And then survivor guilt often is experienced as a wish that the person who is grieving had died instead of the person, you know, who actually did. So the survivor feels like if their person's not alive, then they shouldn't be either. So, you know, I definitely felt like a combination of multiple types of guilt. So causation guilt, survivor guilt, grief, and recovery guilt are ones that for me stood out as being kind of the top sort of guilt feelings that I had, the false guilt. And another type that Miles and Demi didn't address, but I think is experienced by survivors of murder-suicide loss, related, you know, those people that are related to the aggressor in the loss more typically might experience guilt by association. And so that's really a false guilt. It's known as an association fallacy. And you personally didn't do anything wrong, but the person that you're associated with or related to did. So you feel that you're being judged and viewed as guilty for what you did, for what they did, because of your connection with them. You know, if you're connected with the perpetrator through DNA, you know, or you spent a lot of time together and you knew them really well, and then they did this thing, you know, you might feel guilt for that, for what they did. So, but I think it's really essential, you know, to realize and remember that just because we may feel guilty, it doesn't mean we are guilty. And my counselor tells me often, you know, feelings aren't facts. So it's really important to remember that, you know, we can't always believe everything that we feel.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for breaking all of that down. That's really, really interesting. And you're right. I always challenge my clients to challenge their thoughts and their feelings and see, okay, is this actually true or not? Because it isn't always the case.
Yeah, definitely.
Now you've broken it down and talked about lots of different types of guilt. Can you tell us more specifically some of the unique ways that suicide and murder-suicide loss experience guilt?
Yeah, I think people experiencing disenfranchised grief, which is a kind of grief from a loss that can't be openly acknowledged, publicly mourned, or isn't socially supported, like murder-suicide or suicide, have a lot of feelings on that spectrum of guilt. You know, when our grief isn't validated or recognized as real, we don't feel supported or seen, and that can prevent us from being able to really grieve and mourn. Depending on the specific connection to the perpetrator and the victim, and whatever the scenario is, what actually happened, a murder-suicide loss survivor frequently might feel as if it's inappropriate or unacceptable for them to experience or show grief, especially for that perpetrator. You know, a lot of people don't understand why you might grieve someone who committed a crime, someone who took someone else's life, but when you're related to them and you loved them, you know, you understand that what they did does not define them, and it doesn't define their whole life. And you know, we need to kind of, as survivors, hold on to our right to grieve and mourn for our person, no matter what they did. We may, you know, really struggle with that grief guilt and that recovery guilt. There's a lot of back and forth, I think, that happens with those two types of guilt. And we might feel like we're not doing grief right. Murder, suicide, and suicide typically fall into that disenfranchised grief category. And then that layered on that, you have the extra stigma of the manner of death. So yeah, it makes it more complicated in some ways and more layered, like you said.
Yeah, definitely. And apart from what you've just mentioned, are there any other ways that guilt might affect our viewers?
Yeah, I think so. I think typically when we express guilt around a death, people sometimes come up with reasons why we shouldn't feel guilty. So people tell us things like it's not your fault, or you couldn't have known what happened, and those are true. But sometimes, even though they're telling us these things with well intentions, they want to help relieve our guilt. It doesn't really help us sometimes to hear those things from other people. We can't take that in. I think, people think that true guilt is negative and unhealthy, and we need to kind of eradicate that instead of integrating it. But usually the griever didn't want it or intend for the death to happen, and it wasn't their fault. But those feelings of guilt and regret, like all feelings, need validation. And we need to find ways to try to accept and integrate those into our lives as we try to live forward. But we need to hold all those emotions and process them, even those unpleasant ones. So just telling people not to feel guilty isn't really a great solution. The individual themselves needs to kind of come to some terms and understanding of their guilt and sort of work through it in their own way. And I think that we need to think about our guilt, our guilty feelings, and reflect on the reasons why we're feeling that way, and consider some healthy ways that we can cope to work through and find a more balanced place. There's a concept called the tyranny of the shoulds, which I think is good to know. It refers to kind of this self-critical thought pattern that happens when people focus on what they didn't do and what they think they should have done, and they totally lose track or discount all that they did do. And people often regret having left some things unsaid or undone in their relationship with their lost loved one, and they feel that can feel like an unbearable burden. But it's really not that helpful to should on ourselves. And I think it's important that we really do our best not to put so much of a burden of should on ourselves. I know that we want to find reasons for what happened, and we want someone or something to blame for it. So sometimes we end up blaming ourselves, and we feel that there was something that we could have done to foresee or prevent what happened. And in the situation of murder-suicide or suicide, the survivor might ask themselves, could I have prevented this from happening? Did I miss the signs that something that was brewing, that this was coming? Did I really know my person at all? And then how did I not know that something was wrong? Like those are some common questions, and I can tell you I asked all of those questions to myself when my brother died. If the person took their own life or the lives of others, if they were the perpetrator in a murder-suicide, we might feel that if we had just loved them enough, or if they had loved us enough, that they wouldn't have died that way. And I just don't think that loving someone enough is really enough to save them sometimes. It's really nothing that we can't control sometimes, those sort of situations. And there's a lot of reasons why people feel guilt after death. Sometimes there's estrangement. Perhaps you said or did something toward them that you're really remorseful for, and you wish you could take back or undo. And we often replay those things in our minds, on this loop. Like we just ruminate on them, and we see them over and over again, and we think of all the things we did wrong or failed to do. And we think that if we had done those things differently, the outcome would have changed. But oftentimes that's not the case, or maybe that thing would have happened anyway at some point down the line. We want to control those uncontrollable situations. We want to to be able to go back and fix it. And, you know, unfortunately, no one can see the future. So in the moment, we just do the best we can with the information that we have. And so it's not unusual also for survivors, I think, to feel some relief if the death comes after maybe a long period of pain or illness or mental disturbance or uncertainty of some type, like, and that can further fuel that guilt feeling, and it creates that cycle that goes on and on of that emotional tension and upset, you know. But I think relief isn't a bad thing, and I know that I went through that experience myself. It does make sense if you feel like the person that you love is finally out of physical or emotional suffering. There may have been tension around them because maybe they threatened to kill themselves multiple times in the past, or maybe they attempted, or, you know, you were in this kind of cycle of tension with them. And now you don't have to wait for that other shoe to drop anymore. You don't have to anticipate that horrible phone call that the news, you know, that the bad news has come, and now, you know, that the worst has already happened, and unfortunately, but that does bring with it sometimes that feeling of relief, and then we feel bad that we feel relieved, you know, we feel that yeah, that the relief part makes us feel like maybe we didn't love them enough and we didn't want them here enough. And I think that's absolutely not true, but it is understandable if you kind of pull back and look at it, that you might feel relief because this tension has been relieved. It's not that you're glad that they're gone, or you know, that you wish it wouldn't have been different, but we can know that we're not responsible for their death, and that can feel like help us loosen that pressure that we put on ourselves a little.
Yeah, definitely. I think we need to give ourselves lots of grace in those situations. And again, I love how you've broken it all down, how you've talked to us about all the different types, and how you've also shared, you know, some of the questions that you kept asking yourself. And I can tell our viewers that I have been asking myself the same kind of questions for many years. So it's not unusual. And then we still get to decide what we want to do with it, how we want to move forward, I think is the important thing.
Yeah, yeah. Definitely.
Yeah, and you mentioned survivor's guilt briefly earlier. Can you elaborate a bit more around how that might show up for our viewers?
Yeah, I think survivor's guilt occurs when, you know, people feel really guilty because they escaped or avoided some sort of life-threatening event that that others did not, and it's really a common reaction in tragic events and violent loss, those kind of things. So, you know, the guilt is really about the state of the relationship at the time of the death. Or often it is, and no matter how good the relationship may have been, survivor might believe that, you know, it could have been better. And sometimes survivors carry this guilt that somehow they caused the death by their ill wishes or their resentment toward the person. You know, we have this false guilt, and false guilt is a result of distorted thinking, judgment, shame, blame. You know, we do all of those things toward ourselves for things that we can't control, predict, or prevent. So if we developed a sense of self-loathing or shame, it's really important that we seek some help, and we look for someone to talk to, like a counselor or coach, a spiritual leader or a support group, or someone that might have a clearer, less biased view of our situation than we do. They might be able to help us realize when we're being too hard on ourselves, and that they might also help us be able to accept those guilty feelings as kind of part of the normal grieving process, but also help us see that they don't define us and they don't have to define our grief. And I, you know, now that we have lost our person and we know how they died and when they died, you know, we can look back in hindsight, but we can't help but want to impose what we know now onto what we knew then. And we think that we should have known that X leads to Y. And we allow those should haves to twist our regrets into guilt. But that doesn't give us the solution to the actions or inactions of the past. because we can't change what happened. And no matter how much we wish we could, we can't take our person's place. So I think that's important to come to that realization that, you know, we can't take their place. And that's really hard sometimes, you know, it's hard to accept. But it is something that survivors feel that, you know, like it should have been them. But I feel like, you know, if we understand that that's a false kind of guilt, that can help us slowly let go of that feeling.
Yeah, and I love what you said as well about maybe talking to a counselor or a coach or a professional, or even, you know, just a friend sometimes, just to talk these things out, so we don't, like you said, it was for you at the beginning, you were just living in your own head with your own thoughts, and
Yeah,
sometimes we don't realize if some of these thoughts might be irrational, so be able to talk it out with someone, you know, I always call them a kind, patient and non-judgmental. People can help to see a different perspective. So if our viewers recognize themselves, I'd really encourage them to go and speak to someone.
definitely.
Yeah.
Really important.
And can you tell us a little bit how we can, or what we can do specifically to cope with and work through our guilt?
Yeah. Yeah, I can certainly give some tips for that. I mean, I think everyone's unique and we all have to find kind of our own path, but I think these are some good, like just general sort of guidance that can help. I think acknowledging that guilt is a normal emotion and it often comes with grief, especially traumatic loss or violent sudden death. You know, it's normal to have these feelings. So don't shame yourself for feeling guilty. But we also, you know, we don't want to minimize the validity of our grief experience or our guilt. It can help us to recognize the types of guilt that we're experiencing. So I went over some of those before. So thinking about those. In the case of murder-suicide, I think it's really important to realize that we cannot atone for the perpetrator's actions, and it's not our job. It's impossible to make up for their actions. You know, we can't pay the price for their sins or mistakes. So nothing we can do to undo what's happened. And I know that sucks, but it's the reality. So we need to try to let ourselves off the hook for that. But just being okay with and acknowledging that guilt is part of this process of grief, I think, is a first step. And then talking it over with someone, you know, who can give you that unbiased perspective, like a coach or counselor or support group, you know, those things that can be really helpful and healing. And we can bring these feelings of guilt and shame out into the open and express them to others who can listen with empathy, and not let them fester deep inside us, you know, in this isolation. That can help dissipate them and really make them more manageable. And I really believe this quote from author Anne Voskamp, which says, "Shame dies when stories are told in safe spaces." And I think it's really important to remember that, you know, and I know for me, that's been one of the key things, has been telling my story and sharing with people who can hold it for me, you know, and who can hold those feelings and who can support me. That really has been a key thing for me, is talking and sharing and working through those feelings openly and not just staying stuck in my own head. And another thing I think is, you know, we can think about what, if anything, our feelings of guilt or regret can teach us and teach others. So you might be able to educate others on how they can avoid maybe mistakes that you feel guilty about, or you could help raise awareness about some, maybe the cause of death or some of the factors that contributed to the death, like maybe mental illness or domestic violence. Maybe you can use your experience of regret and guilt to help others, which in turn then will help you. You know, I think it's always important to, if we serve others, if we help others, if we try to get outside of ourselves a little bit, that can usually help us in a myriad of ways, with especially with our mental health or feelings of negative emotions. So I think when we consider where our guilt stems from, and we can examine those guilty thoughts, are they irrational? Is it true guilt? Is it false guilt? If it's false guilt, then we need to just acknowledge, that we did our best with the info that we had at the time, and that there were factors in play that we couldn't have predicted or prevented. There's a great tool I can recommend for questioning our thoughts. It's a 4-step question sequence called The Work by Byron Katie. She's written several books, and there's lots of YouTube videos of her kind of demonstrating the work, as she has a free worksheet on her website that can walk you through this process. I'm not an expert in it, but I've heard about it and I know of it, and I use it some in my own process, where you ask yourself 4 questions. Is it true? Can I absolutely know it's true? How do I react, or what happens when I believe this thought? Who would I be without this thought? And then, you come up with your answers for those, and then you do this thing called a turnaround, where you re-examine all of those answers from kind of multiple angles to see if they hold up to scrutiny. And I think that this tool can really be helpful for grievers as we deal with feelings like guilt or other heavy, hard emotions. And then I think we just really, need to do our best to work toward that self-forgiveness, self-compassion, and trying to resolve our feelings of guilt by accepting that, you may have done things that you regret, and, we all do, but we can give ourselves grace, and we can be flawed humans that sometimes make mistakes while we're trying to find our way forward. There's a great book called Self-Compassion by Kristen Neff, and I recommend all grievers read that. It's really helpful, gives you lots of tools for how you can apply self-compassion, how we can treat ourselves like we would treat our best friend, if they were going through something just as bad as what we've gone through. And that can really make a big difference. And we can ask ourselves if others would find us guilty, especially if our person would, that can give us some perspective. If we can imagine what our loved one would tell us about our guilt, would they give us grace and compassion? Would they forgive us for these real and perceived mistakes? And I bet in most cases that the answer would be yes to that. So maybe we can do that for ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely.
Those are some
Love that.
my best tips.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And at the beginning, we've mentioned that you co-lead a support group for murder-suicide loss survivors. Can you tell us a bit more about that, and also how people can contact you if they want to be part of it?
Yeah, of course. So yeah, I co-founded and currently co-lead a virtual support group for murder-suicide loss survivors. We have members from all over the country. To our knowledge, we're the only support group of this type in the US. We're a hybrid traditional support group and action group, and we welcome those that are interested in both of those things. So we meet for about 90 minutes, typically every other Friday evening via Zoom, 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern, but we do switch to once a month meetings during the summer. We're open to anyone who identifies as a survivor of murder-suicide loss. So regardless of their relationship with the deceased. So if they were the parent, the child, the cousin, the best friend, they were maybe an attempt survivor themselves, like, their person maybe took their own life, but attempted to kill them first, that would count as well. So we're just anyone who kind of identifies with that type of loss. We try to leave participants with a tool, a skill, some sort of connection or new perspective that helps them move forward toward their healing goals. And members do need to be 18 or over and currently in or seeking professional counseling. And we ask all attendees to complete an initial screening phone call or video call with one of our leaders to ensure that the environment is really a good fit for them, and that all the group members have safety and privacy. So prospective members can just email me at mygriefconnection@outlook.com if they're interested in joining the group, and then I'll work with them from there to start the process and address any concerns or questions that they have.
Yeah, sounds amazing. I'm so grateful that you've put this together. Like you said, as far as you're aware, that you're the only one in the whole of the US. So wow, that's great. Thank you so much for providing a safe space.
Yeah, it's an honor for sure.
Yeah. So wrapping up then, if you were to leave our viewers with one single action they could take today, what would it be?
Yeah, I think I would just encourage viewers to really start to notice how they talk to themselves, especially around this guilt issue. They can begin to question their feelings of guilt and dig a little deeper to determine if they have true guilt or false guilt. And both types can be resolved or significantly improved when the right approach is taken and support's given. So yeah, seek out that support. Find that safe person or people that you can talk to process these feelings, and be open to hearing their perspective, and just really be willing to believe that feelings are not facts, and that feeling guilty doesn't mean you are guilty.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know you've got a free gift to give away today, which we'll link to below this video. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to share this gift. I created just a free PDF document called Finding the Right Grief Counselor. It just has some basic tips on what to do when you're looking for a counselor, what to ask for, and kind of the steps you can go through. And then it includes a list of some counseling search directories that you can look at to see if you can find someone in your area that would be the right fit.
Yeah, I love that, because finding the right counselor or support person is so important. And I know people who've tried so many different ones until they finally find the right one. So if they can use your question to find the right one right away, that would be amazing.
Yeah.
Oh, well, thank you so much for speaking with us today, Sara. Do you have any final thoughts?
Well, I'm just really grateful to be here and to be able to share some thoughts from my own experience with grief and guilt. And I hope that everyone that watches can take away at least even just one little nugget of information, or one tip, one resource that will empower them to cope with their guilt in a healthy way. And I just, welcome everyone. If you have any questions for me, if you need help finding a resource, please reach out. You can reach me at mygriefconnection.org. You can follow on Instagram or Facebook, or feel free to contact me via email. I'd be happy to help if I can.
Yeah, wonderful. And to our viewers, be sure to tune in to our next interviews for more advice and encouragement on your suicide bereavement journey. Until then, take care and see you in the next interview. Bye-bye.